claim I'm responding to is the lead operator of future manned space flight will be SpaceX rather than NASA. The secondary claims are manned space flight launches are more economically viable through SpaceX than through NASA. The second one is SpaceX has the greater potential for more future manned space missions than NASA. I'm going to respond to the first claim first. The evidence that is provided for his first claim is somewhat accurate besides the $1.5 billion per launch price tag. I'm not really sure where that number came from. And also, the number on SpaceX Falcon launch price was not accurate. Dan Basher, the Director of Engineering Directorate at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center himself said, what we were trying to do is to get the SLS into that $500 to $700 million per flight range, and some of us are working to actually get it even lower than that. Meanwhile, SpaceX's actual cost per launch is around $158 million, which may still seem a lot less, but it's not that simple. That's just the raw number. Now the reasoning challenges. It's not easy to compare these two in the first place when they are made differently. I'm talking about the rockets. Since he's comparing SpaceX and NASA, we're going to compare the two rockets they're making because that's what he's basing most of the information on. So the SLS rocket, which NASA is paying to get built, is made to send as much as they can to one place as fast as possible, while the Falcon Heavy rocket being made by SpaceX was made to send a moderate amount at an ample speed so that the parts would not burn out and could be reused later. So the question is more on whether you're willing to spend money on more than one trip, on more fuel, or on more chances for things to go wrong, since you're going to be reusing that rocket and things can go wrong simply just because that's a fact. With rockets, they blow up sometimes. And so we can choose that, or you can choose the SLS model, which has been proven to work. And so you're paying for a more reliable ship that will get you from point A to point E extremely fast and carry as much as you need without any restrictions on weight. So the counterclaim I've been making is that saying SpaceX is more economically viable than NASA makes no sense since the two companies are working together for the future of manned space flights anyways. SpaceX continually gets government contracts through NASA to help create new technology for future use. Gwen Shotwell, president of SpaceX herself, said, "We would not be the company we are today without that early support from NASA." The truth is that NASA government contracts have been funding SpaceX for a while and helping keeping it afloat while it runs at a net loss, which is backed up by a leaked internal document from a former SpaceX employee that showed that SpaceX racked up losses of $260 million in 2015 and incurred an operating loss every quarter and also negative cash flow of roughly $15 million. Essentially, NASA is investing in SpaceX in hopes of technological breakthroughs to make space voyage cheaper. My response to his secondary claim, challenging evidence. In the point of fact, he writes, SpaceX has a greater potential for more future manned space missions than NASA. Yet there's no evidence to back this up. He cites articles talking about economics involving NASA, but this does not correlate at all to the actual claim. In fact, one of the articles linked showed that NASA's spending helps the U.S. economy as its money coming from the government goes directly to the U.S. economic infrastructure. I mean, which one do you think would be better economically for the country? A private company that has no obligation to give back to its country, or a government-run program that has everything to give back, as is for space voyage and is for the future of mankind. Reasoning challenges. He states that SpaceX has more spending power for manned space missions than NASA, yet the proof doesn't make sense. We get a comparison of NASA's budget and SpaceX's market value as a company, which is not a good way to judge such a thing. Just because SpaceX has more market value, that does not mean they spend every penny on their goal to travel to space. Since they are a private company, they're more likely to be seeking profit. In fact, in the same article I mentioned earlier, made on SpaceX's earnings, showed that the company's annual operating budget is $800 to $900 million. When you compare this to NASA's budget of $19.65 billion cited by his own source, there's no competition. My counterclaim is it's pointless to say that SpaceX will have more future manned space missions when NASA pays SpaceX to send astronauts to their space stations. NASA uses a lot of private companies to send their people to their space stations because overall it's simply cheaper. There's no reason to build their own rockets to send people all the time because they stopped funding their space shuttle program in 2011. And SpaceX gets a big government contract to fund their advancements when NASA asks them to do this for them. Simply enough, NASA does not want to spend the resource to send people to their station when they can contract private companies to do it for them, which helps the goal of space travel overall since SpaceX gets more money to help advancements later. That's all.
Okay, well, I could hear kind of in your argument that you were doing some of those things that I suggested that you don't do at labeling. Well, I have it organized by evidence challenges and counterclaims or evidence challenges and reasoning arguments. That's not necessary. It does keep things a little bit clear, but it also means that you're dividing up some of your secondary points in ways that I don't think necessarily make sense. The challenge that you have on the first point concerning the cost of the two systems, SLS versus the SpaceX rocket, I thought was interesting because you have a pretty good reasoning challenge here. Not so much an evidence challenge, but a reasoning challenge based on the number of flights that you would have to have, based on the amount of cargo or personnel that they would be carrying. I think that that's a reasonable point. Now, it would be interesting to know how many flights you would have to have with the SpaceX to equal one of the SLS flights. We don't really get that kind of comparison, so it's a little bit hard to do the straight numbers game that you are kind of suggesting is applicable here. I do think there's another argument here, and that concerns the number of trips and the greater risk that you're playing on each of those points. If there are failures, for instance, in some of the SpaceX flights, and there are failures in the NASA flights, then I think you can demonstrate that there's always a risk involved in space flight there, and because SpaceX is going to require more, the risks are just going to be exponentially higher because you have more. That's pretty simple. And if we were talking about putting lives on the line, for instance, it's probably best that we have fewer rather than more, and at least until the technology gets better. I kind of like the better argument that you have on at the tail end of this, which is talking about the cost issues. First of all, SpaceX is currently working at a loss. It's losing a chunk of money every year. That seems to suggest that they're not necessarily economically viable. NASA, of course, is a public agency, so it's funded through government revenues, and those are only going to drop if people make a conscious decision to drop them. They're not going to lose money that way. They're going to only get a decline in their budget. SpaceX, for instance, is probably at the mercy of the marketplace, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does seem to suggest that if we're talking about reliability, there would be issues that are concerned there. So I think that that's a good potential argument that needs a little bit more exploitation. On the second point, when you're talking about the potential, your first set of arguments really suggest that you challenging the evidence that the advocate used about its economic viability. That's okay. We're back to the spending thing versus the private thing. I do think that you kind of make an assumption that public spending is better than the private spending. I'm not sure that that's the case. You just kind of ask it as a hypothetical question. I think that's a little bit problematic. I think you have to have some reason to believe that the one is better than the other. I think the comparison of the total budgets of the two is important because it suggests which one is more stable. But the best argument that you have is the argument that, look, NASA is basically funding SpaceX. They contract with them to do a variety of things, and that's, they're not really in competition with one another. They are collaborating with one another. And SpaceX does some things that NASA doesn't do as well, and NASA does things that SpaceX isn't even attempting. And so there's no harm in both of them existing simultaneously. They aren't really in competition. And then you kind of undermine everything by coming back and agreeing with the main premise of the advocate's argument is SpaceX can do it cheaper. And I'm going, no. SpaceX can do some things cheaper, but that doesn't necessarily mean they can do everything cheaper. You got to be very careful about that. All right, thank you.